In part two of this PowerPoint, we're going to look at some of the obstacles to a strong labor movement in the United States, and there are many. There were hostile courts and court decisions. There were political leaders who were very heavily influenced by corporate interests, who did everything they could to get in the way of labor unions gaining strength. There were laws passed by Congress or by state legislatures that made it more difficult. In more recent times, privatization has become a big obstacle to union organizing. And there were also internal divisions in the labor movement that made it more difficult. There was racism, there were ethnic prejudices, and the very idea of the American dream, as we'll see, could get in the way of a strong labor movement. In recent times, globalization has been a major obstacle. And finally, there is aggressive opposition, much of it illegal, by employers, trying at all costs to keep labor unions out of their businesses. Why do they do this? Because workers do better under labor unions, and employers would usually prefer to capture more of the income, more of the profits, simply for themselves without regard for their workers. I'm putting it bluntly here. Now we have a summary slide here, and we're going to go through a bit more information on each one of these obstacles. Let's begin with some examples of court decisions that were hostile to organized labor. Going all the way back to 1842, this was a state-level decision in Massachusetts, but it established a principle, or rather it brought a principle from Britain to the U.S. that lasted for pretty much a century. An employee of the Boston and Worcester Railroad was badly injured on the job, and one of his fellow employees was responsible for that. He had forgotten, I believe, to throw a switch that caused this worker to lose his hand. Now, the worker sued the railroad. The man's name was Farwell. He sued the railroad, and the Judge Lemuel Shaw of Massachusetts, decided in favor of the railroad. And the reasoning was that the railroad wasn't responsible for Farwell's injury. It was another employee, referred to here as a fellow servant. In other words, another fellow employee. And therefore, the company was not responsible. Now, that principle would not apply today, but it did then. And this helped employers to get off the hook to avoid responsibility for injuries to their own employees, even though those injuries had taken place in the course of employment and were not the fault of the employee. Now, I'll give you another example. The Sherman Antitrust Act, which we referred to in the first part of this PowerPoint, was passed in 1890 to try to limit the power of corporations, to try to limit them from creating monopolies, for example. Courts applied this routinely to labor unions. They said, well, if workers are banding together to try to bargain collectively, then they become monopolies, and therefore they're in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. Finally, this was not remedied until the Clayton Antitrust Act 24 years later. Now, Eugene Debs was the head of the American Railway Union. They went on strike against the Pullman Company that built sleeping cars in Pullman, Illinois, which is on the south side of Chicago. And Eugene Debs led a strike against the Pullman Company. There was a court order ordering him to abandon the strike. He disobeyed it, and he was convicted and given 6 months in jail. So the mere act of going on strike was considered a crime. Now, this is a very, very important principle. There was a case of Lochner versus New York in 1905. The state of New York had passed a law limiting the hours that bakers were allowed to work. Being a baker might sound like a pretty genteel occupation. It was not then. The hours were extremely long. The conditions were extremely difficult. And if you go to the PDF version of this, you'll see a link to a video that will help bring this home. The idea behind the Lochner case was that workers voluntarily signed contracts with their employers. And they call this liberty of contract. So for New York, the state of New York, to put restrictions on that was a violation of the workers' right to sign whatever contract they wanted to. Now, what this overlooked was that they really had no choice. If they didn't sign the contract, they could go to another employer who would impose exactly the same kind of conditions on them that Lochner had. So they really didn't have a level playing field. They really didn't have free choice. But the Supreme Court created this fiction that this was a real choice, and therefore they defended the liberty of the contractual rights of the workers. Now, this was so much of a problem, it picked up a nickname, Lochnerism. And there are people today who actually defend the Lochner decision, although most legal scholars consider it to be one of the low points of the history of the U.S. Supreme Court. And this is the link to the video, which is not active in this YouTube version, but you will be able to access it on the PDF version. Now, in 1915, in the case of Coppage versus Kansas, the state of Kansas had passed a law against what were called yellow dog contracts. These were labor contracts that prohibited an employee from joining a union or engaging in any kind of union organizing activity. Employers like Coppage would demand contracts like this. If the job applicant didn't sign it, then he wouldn't get the job. And Kansas passed a law against that, but the Supreme Court said no, yellow dog contracts are legal. And this was simply a follow-up to the Lochner case from 10 years earlier. Now let's go 3 years after that to the case of Hammer versus Dagenhart. Congress in 1916 had passed the Keating-Owen Child Labor Act, which put some limits on how long children could be asked to work. And this was a major cause during the Progressive Era. There were horrible stories of children being put to work in coal mines, being worked insane hours in textile mills, breathing in all that cotton dust. There was enormous abuse of children that took place here. Some parents, ironically, defended the right of children to work these kinds of jobs because, frankly, they needed the income because their own pay was so terribly low. Now, in this decision, the Hammer decision, the Supreme Court said that Congress had no right to put this restriction on. Congress, before they do anything, have to be able to point to part of the U.S. Constitution that gives them the power to do that. And the part of it that they pointed to in Article 1, Section 8 says that Congress has the right to regulate interstate commerce. Now, the court said, well, wait a minute. These children are not carrying things across state lines. What they were doing was making textiles that would be carried across state lines, but they said, well, but the children themselves are not carrying these things across state lines, and therefore the Commerce Clause doesn't apply to this. Now later, in the late 1930s, during the FDR administration, the Supreme Court dramatically relaxed its interpretation of the Commerce Clause, and now in more modern times it applies to all sorts of things. But but this court took the very restrictive version of that, and there are legal forces at work now that want to restrict the Commerce Clause similarly. Now, along with this, there were any number of examples of political leaders who were hostile to the union movement. In the Gilded Age, that would be the late 19th century, roughly from the end of the Civil War in 1865 to around the turn of the century in 1900, numerous Gilded Age presidents would send in troops to break up strikes. For example, President Rutherford Hayes sent troops in to shut down the railroad strike of 1877. President Benjamin Harrison moved against the Homestead strike, against Andrew Carnegie's steel mill in Homestead, Pennsylvania in 1892. Grover Cleveland moved against the Pullman strike. We've already mentioned that, led by Eugene Debs in 1894. And his justification for that was that there was a minor disruption of mail service because of the strike against the railroads. And Cleveland was very clear. He said, if it takes the entire Army and Navy to deliver a postal card in Chicago, that card will be delivered. This was an extremely anti-labor point of view to take. After World War I, a lot of strikers were prosecuted as subversives, in other words, people who were threatening the U.S. government, especially the union that attracted a lot of this attention was the Wobblies, the industrial workers of the world, known as the Wobblies, and they were really the most radical of the labor unions, and they attracted an enormous amount of government attention and hostility. Often strikers were fired, and this was legal. Calvin Coolidge, before he became president, when he was governor of Massachusetts, fired the Boston police when they struck. Ronald Reagan, many years later, in the early 1980s, fired the air traffic controllers who struck. These were public employees, and normally a more moderate political leader would negotiate with them and work out a deal. Not so Coolidge or Reagan. There were also laws that were hostile to unions. In part one of this video, we discussed the Taft-Hartley Act that prohibited a closed shop. That meant it required union membership. The closed shop required union membership in order to work for a particular employer. And the Taft-Hartley Act said you can't do that. It prohibited secondary boycotts, which we've already looked at, and gave the president the ability to shut down a strike. It also allowed employers more leeway in opposing unionization efforts, and they have made the maximum use of this. Very much in line with the Taft-Hartley Act are state-level laws. Michigan has one, and that was a shock to a lot of people because Michigan, in many ways, is the cradle of the labor movement. But Michigan passed a right-to-work law, which says you cannot be compelled to join a union in order to work for a particular employer. So that was a state-level ban on the closed shop. And you can't be forced to pay union dues even if you benefit from that union's activity. So you get the benefit, but you're not responsible for any of the cost of it. All right, another whole avenue of opposition to labor unions, and this happens more in recent times, is privatization. It shows up in education, charter schools, organizations like Teach for America, and there is enormous propaganda and hostility toward teachers' unions. This is applied to municipal services like trash pickup, for example. If they're privatized, if you hire a company like Waste Management, for example, then typically those companies are not unionized, so you remove those public employees from their employment, and therefore you limit the unionization of those kinds of occupations. Prisons are like this too. Private prisons, same issue, that you're reducing the number of unionized employees. Even the military, with private companies like Blackwater in Iraq to provide services, sometimes at much higher costs, that always produce non-union workforces. Now, the effect, as I said, is to reduce the number of public employees who are far more likely to be unionized. Now, we should also mention that there are internal divisions in the labor movement. Let's contrast a couple of unions. The Knights of Labor in the Gilded Age, the late 19th century, were very idealistic. They wanted an 8-hour day. They wanted an end to child labor, a graduated income tax. And their ideal was to have one union for everybody, one large union. They were not terribly successful. The group that was more successful was the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. And under Samuel Gompers, they believed in what he called pure and simple unionism. Small victories in winning just slightly better wages, slightly shorter hours, etc. So, if you could win a wage increase of 2% in 1 year, then you counted that as a victory, and you chipped away at this little by little by little. Now, the AFL was really sort of an umbrella union, like a union of unions, a group of very small craft unions. For example, a union of carpenters, a union of cigar makers, etc. And these were smaller groups. They were discriminatory, as we'll see in a minute. They didn't accept everybody, but they were able to win small victories, and that was something that Gompers decided was the best he could do. His own personal beliefs were more progressive than that, but he despaired of the possibility of trying to create one large union like the Knights of Labor. Now, going right along with that were racial and ethnic prejudices. The AFL was notorious for this. These small unions, like the carpenters or pipe fitters or cigar makers, usually excluded black workers. They were also highly sexist. They sometimes limited their membership to certain ethnic groups, their own little club. And you had to be part of that so-called club in order to be a member of that union and to work in those workplaces. Now, sometimes employers who wanted to break a union would bring in African American workers as strike breakers. And sometimes the white workers had picket lines, and they were outraged when these black workers would cross the picket lines. But when they would complain, the strike breakers, known to union members as scabs, had a ready answer. They said, well, look, if you won't let us into your union, why should we respect your picket line? And there was no really good answer to that, which suggests that what a union needs to do to be successful is to open their membership to everyone. But this was a lesson that the union movement found it very hard to learn for a long time. Now, they did begin to learn it in the 1930s, when larger industrial unions accepted all workers. And the two best examples of that were the CIO, Congress of Industrial Organizations, and the UAW, the United Auto Workers. They did not discriminate on the basis of race or gender. Now, we should also mention another type of racial prejudice, and that was what Southern Democrats did to the New Deal. The New Deal had protections for workers, as we looked at in the first part of this PowerPoint. For example, the Wagner Act, the National Labor Relations Act, that gave workers the right to unionize, but specifically, and the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. But the protections of these laws were specifically denied to two groups of workers, farm workers and domestic workers, like maids. And these were workers that were occupations that were known for a large number of African American members. And Southern Democrats simply would not accept anything resembling racial equality. Now, FDR didn't prefer this approach, but he needed their votes to get his legislation passed, so that's what happened. Now, we hear a lot about the American dream, but it was actually an obstacle to the labor movement. The American dream is very individualistic. It's the belief that if you work hard, if you play by the rules, you can rise without limit in society. You can become rich. You can be a success. And this individualism worked against one of the main values of a union, which is solidarity, which is sticking together, that we fight our battles as a group, that we make our gains as a group. And this really was sort of out of step with this, I'll call it mythology of the American dream, because a lot of these workers were not about to gain riches, but just that belief that it was possible got in the way of a strong labor movement in the United States. European workers are more fatalistic. In other words, what will be will be. We can't overcome the advantages of the elites. And we certainly can't do it alone through our own efforts. So we have to stick together. We have to be committed to our union. And that was an attitude that was much more conducive to a successful labor movement than a lot of the attitudes that you see in the United States. Now, again, more recently, globalization has been a major obstacle to the union movement. Multinational corporations who own no allegiance to any country, and they're only interested in their bottom line. And in fact, they say that if you are following the dictates of a corporation, if you're loyal to the shareholders, then you must not consider anything other than the benefit of the shareholders. This is sometimes referred to as the race to the bottom. If you can make your product for less, for example, by having it made in Bangladesh or in Malaysia or in China, then you owe it to your shareholders to do that. And this does create a race to the bottom in which the lowest wage workers are the ones who get the work. Now, this shows up in manufacturing, especially like in clothing manufacture, but it also has shown up to a great extent in the service sector of the economy, like call centers. You call tech support for some computers, and you will be talking to someone in Bangalore, India. This is part of outsourcing, and it's part of the general phenomenon of globalization. And often this sort of thing is associated with sweatshops. In other words, workers who work extremely long hours for extremely low wages under oppressive conditions, very often using child labor with no right to organize as unions. This is a part of the dark side of globalization. This also often involves evading environmental responsibility, and it's used as a club in the United States by opponents to the environmental movement, by polluters who say that, well, if we accept all of these environmental regulations, then we're costing jobs, we're making manufacturing more expensive, and therefore we should have the right to do whatever we want. Now, some trade policies have been involved in this also, and I should mention that a lot of Democrats have supported, organizations like or agreements like NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Bill Clinton, for example, was a strong supporter of it. In general, the most progressive Democrats, like Bernie Sanders, are opposed to it, but also some of the most conservative Republicans are opposed to this also. These are policies that tend to focus more in the center. So you get odd situations where Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump might, on some of these issues, be on the same side. There's no question, though, that NAFTA increased the power of multinational corporations, and it reduces government's control over their own economies. So producing factories in Mexico, for example, known as maquiladoras, or transferring a lot of agricultural production to Mexico is a good example of the effect of trade agreements like NAFTA. And this has the effect of a race to the bottom, of lowering the wages of American workers and cutting down the job availability in the United States, as well as endangering the environment. And as well as threatening consumer protection, like food safety. A lot of the control over the rules that govern manufacturing, the food industry, a lot of other things are taken out of the hands of each individual government and put in under the control of this international agreement. Okay, now to add one more to this array of tactics that anti-union employers use, there has been some interesting study of the tactics that are used by employers to try to stop unionization. For example, 63% of employers demand one-on-one meetings in which the individual employee is intimidated and told that if you support a union, this will have very bad effects on your future. 57% of employers threaten to close the workplace entirely if the workers unionize. That's a threat that's hard to resist. 47% issued threats to slash benefits and wages. 34% fired workers during union organizing drives. Now that is a violation of the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, but how do you prove it? They can say, well, you haven't performed your job to our satisfaction. You did this or you did that. And it's very difficult to fight this in court, especially when the courts are not that sympathetic. Sometimes they would interrogate workers. They would follow them. They would watch their activities, watch where they met, what meetings they might have attended or sponsored. harass them in various ways. Some of this is very much illegal, but that doesn't stop it from happening. The law is only as strong as its enforcement. There's some very good work done on this. The information above is from Kate Bronfenbrenner from Cornell University, and it was published by the Economic Policy Institute, which represents the interests of workers. Now, in the PDF version, you can look at a number of examples of videos that were published by employers to try to intimidate and scare workers into opposing unionization. Now, finally, let's take a look at a contrast between the late 19th century and more recent times. If you study the Gilded Age, you'll find that there were major strikes, lots of them, and a great deal of militancy and some violence. But there are many fewer protests now, and they rarely involve the intensity of opposition that you could see in the Gilded Age. I think one factor in this is that a lot of workers who worked in the industrial economy in the late 19th century came from farms. They came from what labor historians would call a pre-industrial work culture. Let's say that you're a farmer. You get up in the morning and you determine when you're going to start your day. You get up with the sun. You go to bed with the sunset. You take a break for lunch. There's a holiday and you take it off, and you don't need anybody's permission to do that. You work very hard at planting time and harvest time, and then you slack off a bit in other times of the year. This was considered normal. These were the normal rhythms of farm work. But if you're working in a textile mill, for example, or a steel mill, you didn't have any choice about that. A whistle would go off and you would have to be there. If you worked in the stockyards in Chicago in the early 20th century, for example, if you were 1 minute late for work, you lost a whole hour's pay. It was a whole different culture that a lot of farmers and a lot of immigrants from agricultural societies found it very, very difficult to adapt to and to accept. In the 19th century, there had been a tradition which was much fresher in people's minds of the abolition movement. A lot of labor activists had been very active in the effort to abolish slavery. And they viewed factory work as wage slavery, as reminiscent of the kinds of abuses that had been imposed on slaves, and they objected to this for some of the same reasons. Now today you also have many more pressures from globalization, which we've already talked about. I would add too that there's something called bread and circuses. The ancient Romans, those in charge in ancient Rome, realized that if you could provide entertainment for the unruly masses of people, you could limit the number of protests and the intensity of the protests. And I think you could argue that we do that. We do that. We've done it for decades with television, and we have even more effective electronic addictions in the form of smartphones and similar devices. If you owe a lot of money, you can't afford to lose a job. If you're caught up in a consumer culture and you use credit cards too much and you borrow too much money, then you're more likely to go along with what the employer is telling you to do because you just can't afford to lose the job. Mass incarceration also puts a damper on the labor movement for small things, for nonviolent drug offenses, for example. And so this, I think, is a factor that ought to be considered. There's also an unbelievable ignorance of labor history on the part of a whole lot of people. There was a survey, for example, done right here in our school, in which one high school sophomore out of 70 had even heard of the Flint sit-down strike, which was one of the foundations of the middle class. And I hope you'll take the time to watch that short video on that, because it's very revealing. And as we saw in the last slide, there is very sophisticated anti-union propaganda, and you can see examples of that from the PDF version. Okay, this is at least scratching the surface on the obstacles facing the labor movement in the United States.